From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I hear Democrats saying, we want to abandon ICE. We're not abandoning ICE, and we're not abandoning our law enforcement. Just the opposite.
As President Trump defends his administration's crackdown on immigrants, a federal judge has ruled the government may not arbitrarily detain people seeking asylum. We'll look at the impact of the court's ruling. Let's go to El Paso, Texas, to speak with a lawyer working with asylum seekers along the U.S.-Mexico border. Then, Gitmo started as a detention camp for immigrants. We'll speak with Andrea Pitzer, author of One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. She'll talk about how Trump's tent cities, she says, for migrant children are a new form of concentration camp. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration is ending Obama-era policies calling on schools and universities to consider race as a factor in admissions in the latest blow to affirmative action programs. The move comes as the Trump administration's reportedly planning a challenge to Harvard University's admissions practices, and as President Trump is nearing a decision on a Supreme Court nominee to replace retiring Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was long considered a swing vote on affirmative action. The Department of Homeland Security has been taking DNA samples of immigrant children as it separates them from their parents as part of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance border policy. CNN reports immigration officials have been swabbing DNA from the cheeks of children as young as 2 months old without consent, ostensibly in a bid to later reunite children with their parents. Rights groups have condemned the move, saying it could allow the federal government to track young immigrants for the rest of their lives. Jennifer Falcone of the Texas immigrant rights group Raíces said, quote, "This is a further demonstration of the administration's incompetence and admission of guilt. This further drives home the point we've been saying: they never registered parents and children properly." This comes as President Trump continues to praise the work of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, after a federal court ruled his administration may not arbitrarily detain people seeking asylum. Trump was speaking Tuesday at an event in West Virginia after U.S. District Judge James Boasberg ruled asylum seekers who've passed a credible fear interview should be given humanitarian parole, not indefinite detention.
It is. It's like you're liberating a town. Like in a war, you're liberating a town or an area. And ICE goes in there, and they go in there, and sometimes they have to go in swinging. They don't mind. They're tough. And then I hear Democrats saying, we want to abandon ICE. We're not abandoning ICE, and we're not abandoning our law enforcement. Just the opposite.
In New York City, police arrested 7 activists Wednesday as they protested against family separations at the Statue of Liberty. The demonstration began with activists dropping a banner reading "Abolish ICE" from the base of the statue. Police later arrested Therese Patricia Okumu, an immigrant from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who broke away from the main group and tried to climb the statue. In a statement, the group Rise and Resist called for an immediate end to family separations, adding, quote, "ICE has proved to be a threat to our liberty and way of life and should be abolished. They go after the most vulnerable among us, acting without the process to detain people. For-profit companies are making money off family separation. This has to stop," unquote. In Barcelona, Spain, an immigrant rights activist scaled a monument to Christopher Columbus Wednesday and placed a giant life vest on the statue's arm, reading "Open Arms." It was a protest against Italy's new anti-immigration government, which came as a ship carrying 60 migrants docked in Barcelona after the vessel spent days at sea when it was turned around by Italy and Malta, whose governments are cracking down on the influx of migrants crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa. Members of the group Proactiva Open Arms say they believe as many as 340 migrants have drowned at sea who might otherwise have been saved if their group had been allowed to complete its rescue operations. This is Open Arms spokesperson Mar Seb.
We decided to make this action to spread the word, to tell the people what's happening, and to tell the people that all human rights are on stage right now, and we have to really go out and defend.
In Syria, Russian-brokered talks aimed at forging a ceasefire between anti-government rebels and Syria's government have broken down as regime presses an offensive aimed at retaking parts of southern Syria. After truce talks collapsed Wednesday, Syria and Russia intensified airstrikes around Daraa, and advancing troops captured the town of Tafas near the Jordanian border. The United Nations says more than 270 civilians have fled fighting in Syria's south over the last 2 weeks, with over 200 civilians killed. Human rights groups have demanded Israel and Jordanian authorities open their borders with Syria to allow fleeing civilians to apply for asylum. In the West Bank, Israeli soldiers assaulted dozens of Palestinian Bedouin villagers Wednesday who refused to leave their village near Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem. Video shows Israeli troops punching, kicking and dragging men, women and children after Israel ordered bulldozers to begin demolishing the village, which is home to 180 people. The Red Crescent said the assault left 35 Palestinians wounded. Israel's demolition of the village will clear the way for an expansion of Jewish-only settlement homes on occupied land, settlements that the United Nations has repeatedly said violate international law. In Great Britain, 2 people are in critical condition after they were exposed to what police say is the Russian nerve agent Novichok. The hospitalizations occurred just outside Salisbury, the city where 4 months ago ex-Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were exposed to Novichok in what Britain's government has said was an attack orchestrated by the Russian state. This is Neil Basu of the British Metropolitan Police.
We can confirm that the man and woman have been exposed to the nerve agent Novichok, which has been identified as the same nerve agent that contaminated both Yulia and Sergei Skripal. The latest update we have from the hospital is that both patients remain in a critical condition. Both are British nationals and are local to the area.
Police have cordoned off at least 5 different areas around where the poisonings occurred, though officials insist there's little threat to the general public. Britain and its allies have condemned Russia over poisonings, calling it the first use of chemical weapons on European soil since World War II. In Poland, top judges are refusing to step down after the right-wing Polish government ordered a third of the Supreme Court to retire, in what the European Union and other critics say is part of an authoritarian takeover of the judiciary. Thousands of Polish protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court in Warsaw on Wednesday to support the court's president, who went to work Wednesday in defiance of a new law as lowering the retirement age of the Supreme Court from 70 to 65. This is former Polish President Lech Walesa, who joined Wednesday's protests.
It is getting serious when they ruin our courts. Sooner or later, this may lead to a civil war.
President Donald Trump repeatedly asked senior White House advisors in 2017 about the possibility of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela in a bid to depose President Nicolas Maduro and his government. That's according to the Associated Press, which reported Trump's suggestion in August that the U.S. invade Venezuela stunned both then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. In Colorado, the third largest fire in the state's recorded history continues to grow near Garland in the southern part of the state. The spring fire has so far consumed more than 100 homes and led to the evacuation of more than 2,000 people in Northern California. Warm temperatures and strong winds have fueled a fast-moving fire in rural Yolo County. The fires come amidst a sustained drought in parts of the western United States, and as temperature records continue to tumble around the world. In Montreal, Canada, at least 12 people have died during a heat wave that's seen the city post its highest temperature in recorded history, 98 degrees Fahrenheit. In Central Asia, Armenia's capital posted a high of 108 degrees, while Tbilisi, Georgia, reached 105 degrees, breaking records for both cities as southern Russia bakes under record heat. And last week, a city in eastern Oman recorded the hottest low temperature ever observed, with sweltering overnight heat that bottomed out at 109 degrees. The scorching temperatures come as climate scientists say 2018 is on track to become one of the planet's hottest years on record, possibly surpassing the past 3 years, which are the hottest ever recorded. In Indonesia, at least 34 people died after a ferry began capsizing Wednesday off the coast of South Sulawesi province. Witnesses say the boat's captain intentionally ran the ship aground in an effort to save lives after it began taking on water. The accident came just weeks after an overcrowded ferry boat and on a volcanic lake in Indonesia, killing more than 200 people. And in Chile, a court has handed 15-year sentences to 8 former military officers for the murder of legendary folk singer and activist Victor Jara in September of 1973. In the days after dictator Augusto Pinochet seized power in a U.S.-backed coup, Victor Jara was arrested, tortured, and shot 44 times. He was one of thousands of leftist academics and activists rounded up in a soccer stadium in Santiago, which has since been renamed Victor Jara Stadium. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. A federal judge has ruled that the Trump administration may not arbitrarily detain people seeking asylum. U.S. District Judge James Boasberg ruled asylum seekers who have passed a credible fear interview should be given humanitarian parole, not indefinite detention. The suit was brought by the American Civil Liberties Union, Human Rights First, and the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. Siding with 9 plaintiffs who've been awaiting asylum determinations, Judge Boasberg ordered the government to begin case-by-case release reviews at 5 ICE offices where he said detention had become the default operation: Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia, Newark, New Jersey, and El Paso, Texas.
The ruling comes in the midst of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance crackdown against immigrants. Earlier this month, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced domestic violence will no longer be grounds for asylum, a far-reaching shift that could affect thousands of women fleeing gender-based violence, particularly from Central America.
You do not get to come to America if you have a private threat or someone personally attacks you. You do not get to have asylum for that. It's based on your race, your religion, your nationality, that you're part of some special identifiable group that's being persecuted in your home country. That's what it takes to have an asylum, and we need to get this straight, and I think it will help us. The decision I made, I believe it's right legally. I'm totally confident it's consistent with the intent of the drafters of the INA, our law, and I believe it will help us manage our caseloads better and give more focus to the people who deserve to be given asylum and help us eliminate those that are not worthy of this asylum.
Meanwhile, on Tuesday, Attorney General Sessions rescinded a 2011 Department of Justice guidance that dictated refugees and asylum seekers have the right to work in the United States. Well, for more, we're joined by Eunice Lee. She's co-legal director at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, one of the groups that brought the challenge against the Trump administration's immigration detention policies. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Eunice. Start off by talking about the significance of Judge Boasberg's ruling.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for having me on your show. So the judge's order essentially just required the government to do what it should have been doing all along, which is provide a meaningful opportunity for individuals who are asylum seekers in immigration detention to be released after they pass their credible fear interviews. And in fact, the department's own written guidance states that there's a presumption of release unless the individual poses an individualized flight risk or danger that warrants their detention. And in fact, the judge's ruling recognized that this is not what ICE has been doing in the 5 field offices where we brought suit, and he ordered the government to follow its own written policy.
And Eunice, can you explain why this ruling applies only to these 5 jurisdictions?
Sure. So we brought suit in 5 jurisdictions where asylum seekers there were facing detention rates of 90+%. So for 90+% of our class plaintiffs, they were in fact not being released. They were being denied release, or parole as it's called, despite this written guidance that states that they should be released unless there's a real need to detain them. And what we saw with these 90+% denial rates is that essentially there was no meaningful review of detention decisions by ICE, and there was near blanket detention of people who should have been released, after establishing a credible fear of persecution.
So these 5 jurisdictions, Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia, Newark, and El Paso, explain exactly what will come out of this now. I assume the government is appealing this, but if they were to follow Boasberg's ruling, what has to happen? Will thousands of people be released?
Well, we haven't yet seen that the government is appealing this. And in fact, what the judge's orders requires the government to do is to provide a review of a person's detention. And this should be an automatic review that applies a presumption that favors release. So in general, the department's guidance states that it's not in the public interest to detain asylum seekers unnecessarily after they pass their initial screening interview, establishing a likelihood of asylum eligibility. So what will happen after this order takes effect is that ICE will have to go back, and for our class members who are asylum seekers in detention in these 5 jurisdictions, ICE will have to actually provide a meaningful process to review whether their detention is necessary.
And could other jurisdictions eventually benefit from this ruling?
Well, the ruling is limited again to the 5 jurisdictions where we brought our lawsuit. Certainly, we hope that ICE, that the ruling will prompt ICE to look at its practices and decide to follow its written guidance, as it should throughout the country in all jurisdictions. But, the ruling is limited to those 5 jurisdictions because that's where we saw the most striking and egregious problems.
Let me ask you about the case of Ansley Damas, the named plaintiff in the lawsuit in Damas versus Nielsen. As explained by the ACLU, Ansley is an ethics teacher in his early 40s who fled violence and political persecution in Haiti after speaking out against the corruption of a local politician. He was attacked by a local gang whose members severely beat him, set his motorcycle on fire, threatened to kill him. Fearing for his life, he fled to Haiti, leaving behind his wife, 8-year-old daughter, and 4-year-old son. He not only passed his screening, but an immigration judge here granted his application twice. In each instance, the U.S. government appealed the decision extending his case proceedings, yet he's currently locked up in Ohio, where immigrant detainees are kept in windowless rooms, and he's not been allowed outside in 16 months, in well over a year?
That's right, Amy. So our lead plaintiff, Mr. Damas, as you mentioned, is an ethics teacher from Haiti who fled political persecution, and he came to our shores seeking protection. And as you note, he was in fact granted asylum twice by an immigration judge, and both times the government appealed. And the government, during all this time, which it's now been over a year and a half, has refused to release him despite multiple requests by his attorney or by him, brought, together with his attorney. And he's provided all sorts of information to show that he is not a flight risk or danger. I mean, he was an ethics teacher in Haiti. He has community support. He had a letter from a pastor. He had a place to live. He has no criminal history. And yet ICE has denied multiple requests for him to be released, even after an immigration judge twice granted him asylum, which was appealed by the department.
Eunice, could you explain whether Judge Boasberg's ruling will apply to any of the families of the over 2,000 children who've been separated from their parents, who the Trump administration is threatening to detain together, the parents and the children? Will the ruling affect that at all?
So the ruling, the class members in our suit do include some parents who are separated from their children. But I do want to clarify that the class members are those individuals who presented at a port of entry, so either Border Patrol, port of entry, or an airport, and they were taken into immigration custody from there. So the suit does not apply to families who first crossed the border and then were later apprehended by immigration officials. But, as I said, there are families who presented together at a port of entry and who are separated by immigration authorities, and our lawsuit would apply to the parents in those circumstances who are separated from their children and are in detention.
And again, how many people does your suit cover?
So we estimate that there are over 1,000 class members each year detained in these 5 jurisdictions. So it should, going forward, it should affect, several hundred to over 1,000 individuals in detention each year.
And what about the people who are trying to come over the border? Democracy Now! Was just there last week. We went over 2 bridges from Matamoros to Brownsville, and people are just being told the country is full. And so they're waiting, they're baking in the hot sun. Some eventually, I think, will leave and not go to a legal port of entry. Others just sit there and sit there. That's the legal way to do it, and are turned back.
Right. So, exactly. So the reason many people are forced to cross in between ports of entry is exactly as you said, because CBP, Customs and Border Protection, is simply not letting people through. They're not accepting people who are trying to go to the ports of entry and say, I would like to seek asylum. And in fact, they are supposed to allow folks to seek asylum. Our laws provide a right to seek asylum. We've signed on to international treaties that oblige us to recognize that right, and yet asylum seekers are still being turned away at ports of entry. And this is, as you say, creating a humanitarian crisis for folks who are waiting for their turn and driving many people in desperation to cross and then first and then ask for asylum.
Eunice Lee, we want to thank you very much for being with us, co-legal director at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, co-counsel on the litigation challenging the Trump administration's immigration detention policies. A federal judge has just ruled in their favor. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to El Paso, Texas. We'll learn about a woman inside one of the detention facilities who's been organizing other mothers separated from their children. Stay with us.
So much trouble in the home of the brave and the land of the free. Ooh. Am I an immigrant or am I a new slave made for all brutality? I don't think so. Is it that man has lost his reason? He can't even blame the heat. They're moving like jackals in the hunting season. And the refugee soul is the meat. Oh, yeah. The immigrants are here to stay, to help build America. Oy, 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 oy.
The Immigrants, performed by Gabby Moreno and Van Dyke Parks, proceeds from the new single benefit the Central American Research Center of California. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
The Department of Health and Human Services still has not disclosed how many migrant children they're holding who've been separated from their parents at the border. Last week, HHS Secretary Alex Azar said 2,047 separated minors were still in the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But the department has refused to give updated numbers, even though the Trump administration is facing a July 10th court-imposed deadline to reunite all separated children under the age of 5 with their parents. Meanwhile, CNN is reporting the Department of Homeland Security has been taking DNA samples of immigrant children. Immigration officials have reportedly been swabbing DNA from the cheeks of children as young as 2 months old without consent, ostensibly in a bid to later reunite reunite children with their parents. Rights groups have condemned the move, saying it could allow the federal government to track young immigrants for the rest of their lives.
We're joined now by Linda Rivas, Executive Director and Lead Attorney of Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso, an organization working with asylum seekers along the U.S.-Mexico border. Talk about what's most important right now, Linda Rivas. I mean, this judge's ruling out of San Diego that says by next Tuesday, all children under the age of 5 must be reunited with their families. And 2 weeks later, all of the children, we're talking about over 2,000 of them. As we were down in South Texas this past week, it's almost impossible to get from the government, since this judge's ruling, how many kids have been released? How many are still in detention? They're simply mum at this point. And isn't there going to be some kind of status meeting between the judge and the government tomorrow?
Yes, that is my understanding. So what I can talk about is what we're seeing here in El Paso on the ground. We know El Paso was a pilot program for DHS to test the policy of family separation. What we're seeing now and what we are most concerned about are some of these parents that have deportation orders and whether or not they will actually be reunited with their children, or will they be deported without their children, as we have already seen people be deported without their kids.
Tell us some stories of the people you represent about children and their parents.
Absolutely. So we have one young mother that we met at the detention center just last week. She is a great example of how this administration has criminalized migration at all levels, at all stages. She comes in as a single mother with her 3-year-old child, and she's attempting to cross at a port of entry, seeking asylum in an official way, and she is turned away not once, not twice, numerous times over the course of 3 days. She's alone with a baby who is sick and fussing, and she finally gets to the point where she is sick and tired of being turned away, and she does, in her own desperation, goes around the actual port of entry, and at the minute she does that, she is prosecuted for illegal entry. She is separated from her 3-year-old little girl, and she is detained.
Right. So, Linda, could you talk about, you said that, your focus is principally El Paso, where you are. What are the plans for the Fort Bliss military base there with respect to increasing numbers of detentions?
Absolutely. So we see an executive order from this administration. It doesn't solve the problem of reunifications. We see then a federal order which is very positive in its nature, that it's asking, that it is demanding that these children be reunited with their parents. But what we are anticipating as advocates on the ground is what is next. First of all, the reunification of this many children with their parents, we are still concerned that this is going to actually occur. We're concerned about the children. We're concerned about the parents who may be deported. And then again, we also are very much against the detention of these families. So while they say that separation will no longer occur, first of all, we saw this separation happen before it was an official policy. So how much can we trust this administration that separation will end once and for all, when reunification is such an issue? But additionally, we are already seeing the plans that the facilities will go up in Fort Bliss, that is our own military base here in El Paso, Texas, and they are set to house families. So this is mothers and children and fathers being detained together, and for how long? So that is our concern. We are trying to come together. We are coming together as legal organizations, as nonprofits, as immigration advocacy groups, and we are trying to figure out what we're going to do next.
Linda, you said that even before this became official policy, children were already being separated from their parents. Can you talk about that and when this practice began?
Absolutely. El Paso has been seeing the issue of family separation for over a year now. This has been confirmed by DHS that does state that El Paso was the testing ground. As advocates, we were horrified when we began to see it. And unfortunately, the problem only got worse and worse. We had meetings at the local level with local ICE officials and local CBP officials, and no one was admitting that this was actually happening. It wasn't until the actual formalization of this policy that we began to see it in even higher numbers, and we had to switch our focus as advocates. And that focus was helping one person at a time, trying to secure releases for these parents so that they may be released from detention and we can try and reunite them with their children.
Can you say, Linda, what you think? What are some of the problems with now trying to reunite, what the Trump administration is doing, what efforts they're actually making to reunite these children who've been separated from their parents, over 2,000 of them?
What we have seen throughout these weeks of being on the ground and interviewing mother after mother and father as well in these detention centers is a lack of a plan. We've seen some people facing deportation, and solely based on the individual deportation officer and us advocating for them and saying, will this person be deported with their child? And sometimes the deportation officer will say, yes, we are trying. It just really, to me, shows a complete lack of a system for them to do anything at all. We have heard, we represented one mother who was desperately trying to be deported with her child. She signed her deportation order, and we feel this is absolutely under duress for a parent to be asked to sign a document as to whether or not they want to stay or go, because they don't know where their child is, and they don't know if by signing their deportation order it will bring their child closer together, close to them, or reunite them. And it's just a lack of a system for this reunification. We are incredibly fearful for the people who are still facing deportation, even with this order that is saying that they need to be reunited and there's a certain amount of days. We are scared how this is going to, if this will actually benefit all parents, including parents who are on the verge of deportation.
I wanted to ask you about this Intercept report, headlined, "Immigrant Mothers Were Moved Outdoors During Kirstjen Nielsen's Secretive Visit to Detention. They Shouted for Help to No Avail." The Intercept reports, quote, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen made a series of secretive visits to South Texas immigration detention centers Friday. One of the facilities the secretary visited in Los Fresnos houses parents whose children were taken from them under President Trump's zero-tolerance family separation policy. Many of the detainees there are women, and many desperately wanted to speak with Nielsen. Instead, they were moved to a distant soccer field where they shouted to Nielsen for help, but were too far away for her to hear them. This is quite a remarkable story. And when The Intercept asked DHS about them being moved, they said it was for recreation reasons. Did you hear about this trip that Nielsen made?
I did hear about it, and hearing the stories of these mothers is very reminiscent of the women that I am speaking to almost on a daily basis in our El Paso processing center, the detention facility for immigrants here in El Paso within our city limits. They are desperate. The great example that you spoke of earlier is our client who is organizing the women from within. What she is doing is simply keeping track of women who are coming up to her, speaking to her, and letting her know that they too have been separated from their children. She wants them to be able to get help. So she has come up with this system of writing down their names, writing down the number of children they were separated from, providing us with an identification number for them so that we are able to interview them. So the efforts on the ground are really directly coming from her, seeking out help for us in name of all these women. They are desperate for help. All they want to know is, many of them still need to know where their children are. They need to communicate with their children, and they need to know how quickly they will see their children again. It is complete desperation. We have sat at these cold metal tables with these women, and we have cried together because as advocates, as fellow parents, the pain is unimaginable what they are going through.
I mean, tell us more about this woman you're describing, Mabel Gonzalez, a Honduran refugee who came to this country with her 2 teenage sons. She's absolutely desperate to see them again. She was profiled in the New Yorker magazine with a headline, "The Courageous Woman Who's Organizing Separated Mothers Inside an ICE Detention Center." And we'll link to that at democracynow.org. But this is astounding, the story, and what she is doing inside.
Yes, absolutely. She's incredibly courageous. She, unfortunately, was without representation throughout her asylum case. So this illustrates the other issue I was talking about. This has been going on for a very long time now. She has been detained since September, so she has already gone through the entire process. She went before our immigration courts completely unrepresented, and she finds herself with a deportation order as she has lost her case. But she does not stop fighting for the other mothers from within. She has told them, and this is how she relayed it to me, she told them, you need to keep fighting. Even if I get deported, you still need to fight for your kids. Please find yourself representation, work with these attorneys, and continue to demand to see your children again.
And if Mabel Gonzalez is in fact deported, will she be deported with her children?
So that is an impossible choice that many of these parents are being forced to make. Even after the news of this injunction, which again was very, very good news in demanding that this administration reunify kids in a short amount of time, there's still now a form being passed out to parents saying, would you like to return with your children or not? We have already heard reports on the ground that they are being presented with this information without an attorney present, even if we have the proper documentation submitted to these deportation officers saying, we are the attorneys, we are representing them. They're still going without, not asking them if they want representation, and they're saying, do you want to go back with your children or not? That is an impossible choice to make when they have made that sacrifice. They have fled violence. They came together with their child. They were ripped away from them, and now they have to make a decision. Does my child go back to be in danger with me after all this sacrifice we made, or do I choose for my child to stay and potentially never see them again? And it is a decision that Mabel and I have really still need to explore, because it's such a difficult decision to make.
I mean, what Mabel's doing inside, they're not allowed to have notebooks. And so she's writing down, she's a pastor from Honduras, deeply respected by the women. At first, not trusting, could she be a government agent? She's asking for their information. But one by one, and then Mabel Gonzalez handing this information, very well documented, to one of the people you work with, Linda, at the Las Americas Center, the Franciscan sister named Mary Kay Mauwald. Describe this process of getting information out, this underground railroad of information that you're trying to pass on.
All right. So Las Americas, we have a great team. This sister goes out. She's a volunteer. She goes out to the detention center several times a week, interviews many of, these men and women for possible representation. And she is talking to Mabel, who is seeking help, who desperately needs help. And even amongst the retelling of her own story and seeking help and advocacy for herself, she decides to hand over these loose sheets of paper to Sister Mary Kay and says, get this back to the center and see how you can help. And frankly, it was such a useful piece of information for us, because as a nonprofit, exactly what we want to do is help these women. And so our mission was to speak to every single one. Some of them luckily do have attorneys, although I will say very few. Once we find out they have attorneys, we go on to the next person. We conduct intakes regarding whether, their eligibility for asylum, what kind of claim they have, how can we help them. But then this facet is added to our work as attorneys and immigration advocates of, where's your child? Have you spoken to your child? How often are you able to speak to your child? How soon can we get you reunited? One of the effects from the injunction is that we're starting to see more of these people, more of these mothers on this list granted what's called an ICE bond. And that is, ICE has always had the ability to do this. These women are under the custody of ICE. ICE always has the ability to release them, and they are being granted a bond, most of them in the amount of $2,500, and many of them we're trying to pair them up with the resources in order for them to get out. The first thing that has to happen, the most important thing for mothers that are detained, mothers and fathers that are detained, is to get out of immigration detention so that the reunification process can be possible.
Well, Linda, just to give an idea to people of what kinds of conditions these asylum seekers are fleeing, what you've heard from your own clients, the conditions that they're fleeing in their home countries, and the fact that Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced last month, that domestic violence would no longer be grounds for asylum. He wrote, in fact, that claims by aliens pertaining to domestic violence or gang violence perpetrated by non-governmental actors will not qualify for asylum. So could you talk about first the conditions asylum seekers are fleeing and what the effect of Sessions' decision will be?
Almost every single person that we speak to at the detention center is escaping some form of violence. Some vary in the severity, but we see many women escaping domestic violence, whether that be through a partner that they are actually legally married to, or potentially a live-in partner or a boyfriend, where these women are viewed as property of these men. They are sexually assaulted on numerous occasions. They are escaping kidnapping and death threats, and they come to this country many times after having sought help from their own government, being turned away, or seeing that the government is absolutely inefficient in being able to protect them. Again, this is something that we see often. Gang violence and extortion, these are also themes. But domestic violence is something that we here at Las Americas have defended and defended these claims before the court. To see this decision just with one opinion of one person turn back years, 20 years of jurisprudence, of case precedent that supports the protection of these women, has truly been an assault on asylum seekers. So again, goes towards this criminalization of all migration. These people aren't now saying these people are not worthy of protection when it has been deemed within our legal system that they are.
Finally, do you have any sense that all of these children, I believe there are hundreds of children under the age of 5, will be reunited with their families by Tuesday? That is the deadline. And then 2 weeks later, do you have any sense of government movement?
We're seeing, again, some movement with a limited population of these parents that are now being granted access to a bond. But that's just the first step, is in them being released. They are not just being released, they are being told they have to pay in order to be released. So is this going to happen in this amount of time? It's hard to be hopeful for that, because we've already had some people released, just last weekend, and their children are still not returned to them. So while we are hopeful and we need for this to happen, I don't see it truly being feasible.
And of course, we will continue to follow this very closely. Linda, your thoughts on the DNA testing of the children that's now taking place on the border that CNN is reporting?
So it's scary to know that the documentation may not have been happening accurately in the first place, because those were some reports that we were hearing, that people were being documented correctly and that they knew where the parents were going, they knew where the children were going. Now, this is what was told to us, but yet on the ground we see people not being able to know where their children are, and having trouble with communicating. So while these systems that have been presented to us of the DNA testing and that they're being said, it absolutely has a privacy concern for the future. We don't know how this information will be used in the future. We frankly don't know if some of these parents who end up deported will ever be reunited with their kids, and really the usefulness of this DNA sample.
Well, Linda Rivas, we want to thank you for joining us, Executive Director and Lead Attorney of Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center, working with asylum seekers along the U.S.-Mexico border. We spoke to her by Democracy Now! Video stream in El Paso. When we come back, Guantanamo was originally an immigrant detention center. We'll speak with Andrea Pitzer. Stay with us.
Te recuerdo, Amanda, la calle mojada, corriendo a la fábrica donde trabajaba Manuel. La sonrisa ancha, la lluvia en el pelo, no importaba nada, ibas a encontrarte con él, con él, con él, con él, con él. Son 5 minutos, la vida es eterna en 5 minutos. Suena la sirena, de vuelta al trabajo, y tú caminando, lo iluminas todo, los 5 minutos te hacen florecer.
Te recuerdo, Amanda. I remember you, Amanda, by the legendary Chilean folk singer Victor Jara. This week, a judge in Chile ordered 15-year prison sentences for 8 former military officers for Victor Jara's murder in September of 1973. Jara was tortured and killed, his hands broken, the famous guitarist, after a U.S.-supported coup d'etat ousted the democratically elected socialist President Salvador Allende and installed the 17-year dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Has the Trump administration set up concentration camps in Texas for migrants? The answer is yes, according to at least one expert, Andrea Pitzer, the author of One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. In one of her latest articles, Pitzer writes, quote, "While writing a book on camp history, I defined concentration camps as the mass detention of civilians without trial, usually on the basis of race, religion, national origin, citizenship, or political party, rather than anything a given individual has done. By this definition, the new child camp established in Tornillo, Texas, is a concentration camp."
Andrea Pitzer goes on to write, quote, "While tragic, this is hardly surprising, since the innovation of concentration camps rose in part out of the willingness to detain children." In another article, Andrea Pitzer looks at how Guantanamo started as a detention camp for immigrants. Andrea Pitzer joins us now from Washington, D.C. Andrea, welcome back to Democracy Now! So that is your latest headline for the Daily Beast. History lesson, Gitmo started as a detention camp for immigrants. Explain.
Basically, in the early 1990s, there were waves, tens of thousands of people in all, of refugees from Haiti and from Cuba that were heading toward Florida. And the U.S. Did not want to let them touch down, which would make their asylum claims much stronger. They didn't want to let them touch down on U.S. soil. So they interdicted them and held them at the naval base that had already been there for a very long time at that point. But they created a detention site to hold them. And so you had this argument that happened on a policy and court level over whether they could be forcibly repatriated. Would that be in line with international treaties? Meanwhile, they were detained for a very long time, and you ended up with rioting. You ended up with guards being investigated for abuses. You had the most problematic prisoners being detained at Camp X-Ray, a chain-link fence caged area. And eventually, after several court battles, it was decided that that there was not standing, that they, in fact, the courts couldn't rule that this was U.S. soil and that the claim wouldn't be heard. But then there was another court case where, because of HIV-positive detainees who were being held in isolation without access to legal or medical care, a court agreed that they would hear that case. And as soon as the court agreed that they would hear that case, at that point it was the Clinton administration settled and made an agreement that would allow a certain number of people into the U.S. on certain categories. And that was in part to keep the courts from having jurisdiction at Guantanamo. And what's interesting is this, from this original basis of it being a site for detention, indefinite detention of refugees, that was a big part of the basis for why it was chosen after 9/11 to house terror suspects, because there was this idea that the U.S. courts wouldn't be able to intervene because they wouldn't have the standing to do so.
Well, you write in your piece, in the same Daily Beast piece, quote, the longer the detention and the more secret or hidden the facilities, the worse the possibilities for what can happen. So talk about what you write about in your book and what you've seen happen to detention camps apart from Guantanamo, and how they've come, in your view, to resemble concentration camps.
Well, this is my worry about the camps at the border. We have this policy, which we just heard earlier on this show today, was in place and being used in some ways before it was even formally announced. We're hearing that they're going to be moving some of these detention sites onto military bases where we'll have less access, we'll know less what's going on. And this goes back to a number of different camps that we've seen in the past. One of the saddest examples was in France in the late 1930s, when the Spanish Republicans were losing to Franco in the Spanish Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of them came across the border into France, and France wanted to keep them away from their main cities, so they built these pretty shoddy refugee camps. And they definitely started as refugee camps, but then when Hitler started World War II, they began shoving enemy aliens, so Germans who had fled Germany. Some of them were Nazis and Nazi sympathizers, but mostly they were Jewish refugees. So these communities were shoved together in these same camps. They evolved into these enemy alien camps, and conditions were awful there. People considered committing suicide. Children died in them. And then once France fell to the Nazis then actually took the Jews who had been held in these camps that hadn't escaped in the meantime, and they were deported to Auschwitz. And I don't think that Germany is going to invade, and there are not death camps, in play right now in the U.S., but it's very problematic, this detention that we're seeing, new doors opened to new kinds of detention, the deliberate separating of children from parents. I mean, what can you take from people who have nothing? You can take their children. And so we're deliberately inflicting harm on this vulnerable population. And when you look at that in connection with history and what other things tend to accompany crisis situations where things go terribly wrong, we have a few other elements in play right now as well. We have the denaturalization of citizens that's being looked at, and the Trump administration. Explain that, Andrea. Well, there's a new office being formed, and they've already started doing it with some of these cases, in which they're going to revisit naturalized citizens' applications and review them for whether they were misrepresenting certain things, whether they committed small crimes a decade or more ago that would technically allow that to be stripped. But it's just the overall approach of stripping citizenship is something that we see when we see this kind of irregular detention growing. Often it's accompanied in governments that go quite badly, that do bad things to their citizenry and to outsiders. It's accompanied by this wish to strip citizenship from people that you think don't deserve it. The most famous example, of course, is Nazi Germany stripping all German Jews of citizenship. But there are other examples. And I think this targeting that we've seen again and again through the rhetoric of animals and rapists that we see at the highest levels, combined with these policy efforts. And then last week as well, with this decision by the Supreme Court on the U.S. travel ban that the administration tried and tried and tried again until it could sort of pass muster. And that decision from Roberts last week said that the forcible relocation of U.S. citizens to concentration camps solely and explicitly on the basis of race is objectively unlawful. But a lot of scholars said right away, first of all, this is just limiting it to U.S. citizens, so does that okay concentration camps for other people? And then also, the original Korematsu case from World War II, when Japanese Americans were interned, it was done on just the same basis. The judges argued at the time it was not solely because of race, but in retrospect, of course, it was obvious that it was. And so now the court, even while sort of seeming to set aside the ability to create those kinds of camps, has provided the administration a fig leaf to say, if you suggest it's on any other terms, we'll defer to your authority. So the court's deferring to the executive. the stripping of citizenship, this kind of growing new irregular detention that's being done punitively. We're still a democracy. We still have a lot of ways to take action, but I think that it's very problematic moving forward. This is the kind of stuff we see where you end up with concentration camp regimes.
Andrea Pitzer, you mentioned Fred Korematsu, who was the Japanese-American challenging the detention of Japanese-Americans in World War II. Over 110,000 Japanese-Americans in this country. Later, the government would apologize. Well, last month, federal judge Dana Sabra in San Diego ruled all children under the age of 5 must be reunited with their parents within 14 days. Tuesday's the deadline for that. And all children above 5 must be reunited with their parents within 30 days. So the government has 2 more weeks for that. We're talking about over 2,000 children. Now, interestingly, in an interview with the North County Times in 2003, and this is out of the San Diego Tribune, Judge Dana Sabra said his experience as a Japanese-American shaped him. He said, quote, "In light of that experience, I was raised with a great awareness of prejudice. No doubt. There were times when I was growing up that I felt different and hurtful things occurred because of my race." Judge Dana Sabra is a Japanese-American. His mother was Japanese. Andrea, talk about the detention of Japanese-Americans in this country.
Well, I think it's a story that people think they know, but they don't actually know, and it's really relevant today. There's between 110 and 120,000 Japanese and Japanese-American people who were detained after Pearl Harbor, and a lot of people think that it was done out of sort of this fear reaction to this horrific attack. But in reality, there was a government analysis by one of their top intelligence people at the time that very intelligently analyzed that it would be useless to detain this group, that it was already known that about 300 people or so that were actually dangerous, they could be rounded up, that it might do much, much more harm and create a kind of backlash to actually detain these citizens. This was all known. And in fact, Hoover, who does not exactly have a great civil rights record, J. Edgar Hoover, at the time in World War II, did not think that mass detention was the answer. So there were many people in the White House, in the administration, in the military, who knew that this was a useless thing. It became part of a political objective. It got swept up in just the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing today, where people got political advantage and power from damaging and doing great harm to a vulnerable minority in the country. And what's interesting is that this information, these intelligence reports, were actually concealed by the U.S. Solicitor General. When that Korematsu case went before the Supreme Court, that information was suppressed and it was not introduced. And I think that anyone who looks at this administration today and thinks that it would be more likely to turn over that kind of information in these kinds of court debates, I'd be very skeptical that they would be even more forthcoming today. And so whether the justices would even get the full picture of what's going on if something similar were to come back, I think is a real question as well.
Well, Andrew, do you think that the term concentration camp is appropriate in this context? Because most people's association with that term is, in fact, with extermination camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka during the Second World War.
I think that we need to sort of recapture this word concentration camp. It should be that Auschwitz is the first thing that people think of, Auschwitz and the death camps, when they hear the term, because it's the most horrific industrialized version. I mean, it created this genocide that killed millions. So it should be the first thing we think of. But people forget that Auschwitz, before it was a death camp, was also just another camp that was part of the regular Konzentrationslager system in Germany. And that system existed for several years before it evolved and changed and grew into a horrific killing machine. And there were also almost 4 decades of concentration camps, things that were called concentration camps, civilian detention on the basis of identity that happened before that. And so we need to keep in mind, how do you get from regular democracy and regular life into something like the death camps? And the truth is, it takes several years of propaganda, of manipulation of the public, of bending the courts, of weakening legislatures. And so it's those warning signs and those preemptive things we should be thinking about, rather than just that Auschwitz becomes then some island of isolation that came out of nowhere, because that's not how it happened. I think we need to reclaim this term concentration camp for this kind of irregular detention of civilians without trial.
Andrea Pitzer, we want to thank you so much for being with us, journalist and author of One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. We'll link to your piece, History Lesson, Gitmo Started as a Detention Camp for Immigrants, and Why the Tent City for Children is a Concentration Camp. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.